Shalom, everybody. Welcome to tonight's share where we start the fourth book of the Torah, which is called Chumash Bamidbar. In English, it is called the Book of Numbers, and another word for it in the Medrash is the same in Hebrew, Chumash HaPikudim, the Book of Counting. Because in this book, in Bamidbar, we begin with a census of each tribe of the Jewish people with their leaders. Then the Torah repeats in a way the census because it tells us that the 12 tribes were divided into 4. So each direction had 3 tribes, and those 3 tribes had one tribe that was the leader. They also had a special flag, the Torah goes in to tell us. That flag contained 3 colors. The colors were got from the breastplate that the Kohen Gadol wore. Each one had a special gem with a different color. So those colors went for the 3 tribes. And so it was a tricolored flag, and we will discuss shortly about those 4 directions and the way they traveled and camped. But it's interesting to note that the portion of the Chumash Bamidbar, those who are learning the Rambam 3 chapters per day will know that the Rambam in today's lesson talks about the Torah reading over a year, and he points out that there are certain Torah readings that take place just before the Yom Tov, and Bamidbar takes place, he says, before Shavuos. Exactly like this year, the week after this Shabbos is Shavuos, Friday and Shabbos, and we always read Bamidbar just before it. The word Bamidbar actually means a desert. And why do we read in the desert just before Shavuos? Because the Torah was given in the desert. And the desert is open public land, showing that it is easily acceptable to any person who wants to study it. You don't have to come from an important family, not a rabbinic family, not a family with a Torah background. Anybody who wants to study Torah, it's like a desert. It's open to anyone could go there and to study it. And so we actually found with Rabbi Akiva, the hero of Lag BaOmer. He came from converts. He didn't start studying till he was 40, and he mastered it to such a great deal that he is one of the greatest sages who ever lived. The other thing is, he points out that a desert is empty and desolate. And just as a Jew who wants to study Torah should be empty and free of arrogance and vanity. In fact, we are told Torah is the realm of those who are humble. Torah is compared to water. If you put water on a slant, it will roll down. The same, the Torah goes to those who are humble, like the desert, which is empty. The other thing is that the goal of Torah is to elevate the world. And so, even those places which are most spiritually uninhabitable places represented by the desert, the Torah is there to uplift it. And the other thing is, the desert is a very difficult, challenging place. And even when we find ourselves facing hard and difficult challenges, like in a desert, we must still remain loyal to the Torah. And the lesson also is, every nation becomes a nation by being a part of a country. South Africans, because you live in South Africa. Eventually, if a South African will go to Canada, his grandchildren, etc., will become Canadians or Australians or whatever. But that's because the country is their identity. That is their citizenship. Here we are being taught, you know what our citizenship is? When did the Jewish people stop being a family and becoming a nation? When they left Egypt and received the Torah 3 months later on Shavuos on Mount Sinai. Our citizenship is not associated with a country. We were in a desert. Our citizenship is the Torah. The Torah is what identifies us as Jews. And that's why the Jewish people, as long as they adhered to the Torah, throughout their thousands of years of exile, without a homeland, without a country, were still able to retain their identity as Jews as long as they kept to the Torah. Sadly, those Jews who fell behind, who stopped, abandoned the ways of the Torah, there's nothing left of their descendants. So that's the other lesson of Bamidbar and Shavuos. We want to retain our Judaism throughout the ages. Stick to the Torah. Now, there are no mitzvahs in this portion, but as we began saying, we read a very fascinating account of how the Jews camped and rested and traveled in the desert. You know, there were called 3 camps. The most inner camp was called Machna Shechina, the camp of the divine, because that camp was the holy Mishkan, the tabernacle, and you had to be pure. You couldn't become Tameh, which is a ritual, a spiritual impurity. You couldn't enter that camp. Then there was a second camping, which was called Machana Leviah, the camp of the Levium. Because as you know, Levi had 3 children, Gershon, Kahos, and Merari, and you had Moshe and his sons, and you had Aaron, the high priest, and his sons. So those were the second camp called Machna Leviah, around which they camped. Each family of the Levium took a different side, and Moshe had the 4th side. And the 3rd camp were, as mentioned, 3 tribes on each side. So you had on the east, the west, the north, and the south. They were the protectors of the Mishkan. And when they traveled, Rashi tells us, they traveled in the same formation. But these 3 tribes were also kind of, as well as the Levium, they were kind of a security detail around the ark. And the book points out that when a security detail surrounds an individual, you know what that shows you? That the person they are securing is important, famous, or powerful. And whenever others come to meet him, seeing the guard standing at attention will keep them in a humble frame of mind the entire time they are in the presence of that person. I mean, we just celebrated the coronation of King Charles with all that pomp and ceremony and all the guards and the changing of the guard and the ganze Geschichte. That makes one realize that they're in front of a king and humbles them. And so too, the large formation of Jewish people surrounding the Mishkan, as mentioned in these three camps, they inspired awe and served as a constant reminder that they are in front of God and of God's greatness. And there's a famous line that is in many shuls. It says, Da lifnei mi ata omed. Know before whom you stand. Although it is not in the Chabad shuls, we are told that we have to have that in our hearts at all times. And this awareness of God's presence needs to be with us at all times, especially while in an unsettled state, wandering in the desert with no permanent home. And while the Jews traveled and faced the discomfort and the hardships of the road, they maintained their positions around the Holy Tabernacle, around the Mishkan, because that reminded them of Hashem's company even during tough times. And it's not only in those days and in the desert. We also have a Mishkan within ourselves. V'osuli mikdash v'shachanti b'seicham, God says. Make for me a sanctuary, I'll dwell within you. And the neshama, the soul, is the personal Mishkan inside each and every one of us. And it must be carefully guarded on all four sides to inspire the awareness of its holiness and potential. Constantly on guard, protecting it from any corrupting influences will impress upon us the appreciation of the neshama, its soul, and our mission here on earth. We must be aware of the value of the neshama at all times and take the necessary precautions to protect its purity. And we are told, a palace that has guards can never be compared to a palace that doesn't have guards. And that is a palace that has guards. It is awe-inspiring, and it sends a clear message to everybody around about the honor of its inhabitants. And so too, every Beis Hamikdash, as we read, as we learn in the Talmud, it had so many guards, and that wasn't for protection. That was more to inspire reverence in the Jewish people. And by the way, my friends, every single shul is called a Mikdash Shmi. I don't know what happened there, but it's a mini Beis Hamikdash. And as such, it is a holy place that must be respected and revered. We have the laws coming up in the Rambam. And we learned that actually one should not chatter, run around in a shul, don't make it a shortcut. The focus should be on davening alone. Maintaining a respectful attitude towards a shul gives it dignity and importance. And it serves to remind us in whose home we are standing. And do you know the Beis Hamikdash was built with only the best, most expensive materials? Much of it was made out of solid gold. And that is because holiness must be treasured, and so that just seeing it in all its splendor inspires the view with the awe and respect for God's Shekhinah. There's a beautiful story that he brings of two holy Rebbes, Reb Meir Premishlanner and Reb Yisrael Rizhiner. They lived in the mid-1800s, and they were colleagues. But their lifestyles were very, very different. Reb Meir Premishlanner lived very simply, very frugally. He often gave the only coins he had to charity. He wouldn't go to sleep if he had money in his wallet. Where's Rabbi Yisrael Ruzhiner? On the outside, certainly, he lived affluently, comfortably, surrounded by luxuries. And one day they passed each other on the road. Rabbi Yisrael was on top of a beautiful, unbelievably looking coach, the Rolls Royces of coaches. And he had 4 strong steeds, horses schlepping it. And Reb Meir sat in a decrepit wagon pulled by a single skinny-looking horse. And Rabbi Yisrael pointed out, you see this team of horses? I always make sure to travel with 4 horses, 4 horsepower. So if I ever get stuck in the mud, the combined efforts of my horses will get me out faster. And the mayor said, I believe that a person must be humble and protect himself from falling in the mud in the first place. I only have 1 horse. It's so skinny. Therefore, I cannot risk any missteps. I have to remain vigilant of my surroundings and protect myself from falling astray. And my friends, spiritually, that is a very powerful lesson for all of us. We only have 1 horse. Stay away from any evil. And that leads to the next aspect that we're talking about in the book. And we're talking about the different, as I mentioned, the different camps that they traveled to. On the south side, there was the camp of Reuven, and Reuven was next to the family of Kahas. Who was the family of Kahas? Who did they have as a descendant? They had Korach. And we know that many of the tribe of Reuven joined Korach when he rebelled against Moshe and went down into the ground with him. And the Talmud says, how come? Because Oile Rasha, Oile Shchenai. Woe is to the wicked one, and woe is to the neighbor. If you associate with people that you shouldn't, it ends up having an influence on you. On the other hand, Yehuda and Yisachar, they were next to Moshe Rabbeinu. And that influence really spread over them so much. As a result, Yehuda got the royalty, he became the king, and Yisachar were known to be the ones of the crown of Torah. And that is because Toivla Tzadik, Toivla Shchenai. Good is to the tzaddik and good is to his neighbor. The atmosphere in which we live has a tremendous impact on our thoughts and feelings, says the Talmud. And therefore, it is the environment that can change a person to either become positive or negative. And this we see from the sages' teaching. Keep very far from a bad neighbor, and don't be closely connected to a wicked person, because it'll lead you down. On the other hand, it says, Oile Rasha, Oile Shchenai, woe to the wicked one, woe to the neighbor, and good to the tzaddik, and good to the neighbor. The question is, who influences who? If you're a good person, you create the atmosphere, and then it becomes Tov LaTzadik, Tov LaShchenai, good for the tzaddik and good for the neighbor. On the other hand, if you let him create the atmosphere, then it becomes just the opposite. Woe to the wicked one and woe to the neighbor. It's up to you. This is what the Rebbe taught us too. And therefore, he points out, if you encounter people, try and help them. Make them sure that you are the positive influence on them, not vice versa. And just as we will never abandon a brother or sister, we must never abandon a Jew who needs our physical and spiritual help. At the same time, we should choose to surround ourselves with those who will be a positive influence on you. Seek to associate with and live around the people from whom you can learn, become a better person as a result of being around them. And we are told that when it comes to good influences, says the Talmud, Geidel Shimusha Yosemim Limuda. It is even greater to serve a sage than studying from him. Because when studying, you acquire the knowledge. But when you serve him and you have to be on hand, you become influenced by that tzaddik and you can acquire a whole new way of life. The Parsha, Bamidbar, also, which we read about having good neighbors, is read just before Shavuos. And this emphasizes the fact that all of the Jewish people stood together as one. They didn't allow arguments or evil influences from their neighbor affect them. It's a critical way of accepting the Torah. That's what we see by Abraham and Lot, that Lot, while he was with Abraham, he reaped such incredible benefits. When he went to Sodom, he deteriorated and lost everything. And it tells a beautiful story about Moshe, who was an innkeeper, a pious Jew. He learned Torah wherever he had a chance and performed mitzvahs. One day, a rowdy crowd entered his inn. They had a big argument about how to divide their earnings from the latest big business deal. This Moshe had an aptitude for math, and he intervened, and he helped them settle the differences. And they were so satisfied that they offered him a job as their accountant, to which he agreed. But then, it didn't take him long to realize what their business was. They were actually thieves. And they earned money by taking it from innocent travelers. Despite this, the earnings was just too great. Moshe couldn't resist, and he decided to continue working with them. After all, he said, I'm not stealing anything. I'm just counting the money and helping them. But slowly but surely, Moshe spent more and more time with his gang, and his piety suffered. He himself ended up holding up travelers and stealing from them. One night, he happened to meet an old acquaintance, another chassid, who was traveling to the Rebbe Rabbi Yisrael Rizhiner. Suddenly, he realized how low he had fallen. By hanging around bad company, he himself was influenced. He joined the chassid on his journey, and he left behind their wicked ways, and he became a pious Jew again. Realize how much influence has upon us. You know, the Torah goes, as I said, it's accounting. Rashi says that this shows us how much God loves us. You know, if you like something very much, you're continuously counting it. You see with children, etc. And in this portion, God counts the Jewish people as a sign of his love. In the Torah too, that we're going to read, Hosea Hanavi prophesies that the population of the Jewish people will be vast when Mashiach comes. Then he rebukes the Jewish people for their unfaithfulness to God, but he concludes with the promise that when Mashiach comes, they will return to God and merit to serve him in peace and posterity. That's what we read in the Haftarah. May it be soon. Have a Shabbat Shalom. Thank you. I hope you find it inspirational.